Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New York Academy of Medicine Library's 2022 Bibliography Week Lecture, which thankfully this morning we are doing virtually because if the view out your window looks like the view out mine, there is snow. For those of you who haven't been to any of our lectures or events before, I'm Arlene Shaner, the Historical Collections Librarian at the Academy, and it's a pleasure to welcome you, even though we are still limited to a virtual space. I want to take just a moment to talk about our organization, which turned 175 years old this month. At NYAM, we are very much interested in promoting health equity by tackling the systemic barriers that continue to prevent everyone from leading a healthy life. We do this by generating knowledge through research, changing systems, and engaging with the public to ensure health for all. The library was founded at the second meeting of the Academy on January 13th, 1847. Only our fellows had access to the collections in the beginning, but in 1878, the Academy voted to open the doors of the library to anyone who wanted to use it. And we are still the only medical library in the city of New York that is accessible to all. We have one of the best history of medicine and public health collections in the country, if not the world, and we invite you to connect with us by visiting in person or through our digital collections, newsletters, events, and virtual visits, which can be found on our YouTube channel. And now we'll turn to a couple of housekeeping issues. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available online soon. After the talk, there will be time for questions and answers. Please drop your questions into the chat at any time during the talk, and I will share as many of them as I can with our presenter when we get to that part of the program. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrew Curran, who will be our speaker this morning. I first met Andy, who is an 18th century specialist and the William Armstrong Professor of the Humanities at Wesleyan University in the summer of 2010, when he spent a month in residence in the Rare Book Room as our 2009-2010 Paul Klemperer Fellow in the History of Medicine. At that time, Andy was working on the project that became his first book, The Anatomy of Blackness, Science and Slavery in an Era of Enlightenment. After his time as a research fellow, Andy was nominated for and elected as a NYAM Fellow, and I believe that he may be the only one of our residential research fellows to have continued his connection to us in that way. His next book, Diderot and the Art of Thinking Freely, received multiple citations as one of the best biographies of 2019. This March, his newest book, Who's Black and Why? A Forgotten Chapter in the 18th Century Invention of Race, edited with Henry Louis Gates Jr., will be released by Harvard University Press and is the subject of his talk this morning. He's currently at work on a project entitled The Race Makers, a book that he describes as the first biographical history of race, and one that I very much hope will bring him back to the Rare Book Room for more research in the collections. Thank you, Andy, for agreeing to speak this morning about the Bordeaux Academy of Sciences and the Great Race Contest of 1741.
Mute myself at this point. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. So anyway, I'm delighted to be here today. I want to thank Reggie Richards-Peel and Joseph Argabright, and especially Arlene for that really wonderful introduction. As she alluded to a second ago, she was really a great help to me about 12 years ago when I was writing my second book on the Anatomy of Blackness, which was very much tied to the collections. I'd actually worked on something before. I remember coming to the Academy to look at an exhibition on monstrosity for my dissertation and my first project on human monstrosity. And so there's been I've had a long kind of connection to the library, and I was hoping to be there in person, of course, today, but it's best, as Arlene was saying, that we do this by Zoom today. Anyway, as we were talking about, this is kind of a big spring for me because I'm putting this book out with Henry Louis Gates Jr., who asked me to collaborate on this project. I'm really excited to talk to the Academy about this. In many ways, this is the continuation of the Anatomy of Blackness book, even though there was this big intermission when I was working on the Diderot project. So I'm going to share my screen at this point. And I'm going to pick out my slideshow. And there we go. There we go. So I'm going to actually show you the cover here, which I think is interesting for hopefully some of the people in attendance here today. This is done by a African-American designer who works with the Hutchins Center at Harvard University using 18th century script. And it's kind of this general idea of who's black and why is the kind of overarching theme for this contest that I'm about to talk to you about today. This is really a forgotten contest. It was a European-wide essay contest on the source of black skin and hair, announced by the Bordeaux Academy of Sciences, the Royal Academy of Sciences in 1739. And in many ways, this is an institution that incentivized, on a certain level, the crystallization of race at the time. I think probably these same kind of debates were taking place at the New York Academy of Medicine, 60 or 70 years later. Let me show you a couple of slides here of the actual essays themselves. It gives you the kind of material, an idea of the material we were working with. I discovered this contest, it'd been alluded to, but I really was the first person to work on it when I was writing this book, The Anatomy of Blackness. And having been, I've been studying the contest for a long time, but then when Skip Gaze got in touch with me, we went right back to the manuscripts and started really poring over them in a very different way. And we supervised the translation of the 16 essays I'll be talking to you about today. We also supplied an enormous introduction and a chronology of race that's going to be part of this book. I want to talk about this contest. And in order really to understand why this whole thing took place, we need to talk about Bordeaux, obviously, especially its academy. Bordeaux's Royal Academy of Sciences, like many provincial scientific communities in France, was founded at the beginning of the 18th century in 1713. This is obviously also happening in the United States, albeit a little bit later. The American Philosophical Society was founded in 1743. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences, this is John Hancock and John Adams, founded this academy in 1780, as I was saying. And it's interesting to think about the New York Academy of Medicine in this context, in relationship to this kind of phenomenon taking place in Europe and in North America. Now let's go back to Bordeaux here. This is an image of the Bordeaux Academy taken obviously in the 19th century. Since this time, this building, the foundation is still there. The first two floors are there, but they built up a couple of new floors there. So it doesn't quite look like this at this point. We have to imagine that this is obviously not a university. Academies are very different from universities. Universities at the time in the early and mid 18th century are really in the business of replicating knowledge. They are not in the business of producing knowledge. Generally, they're passing down these Aristotelian truths, the synthesis of the Bible, and kind of compatible science. So, Aristotelian science. So anyway, universities are in the business of producing lawyers and priests and knowledge, and I'm kind of exaggerating here or reducing this maybe a little bit too much, but knowledge at this time is really pretty static. There's no research, there's no experimentation taking place in universities. We hear about the Sorbonne, the great Sorbonne. The Sorbonne in the 18th century is actually the faculty of theology within the University of Paris. Here at the Bordeaux Academy, we are looking at 40 or so elite members of Bordeaux, generally aristocrats, often magistrates, and they're getting together and are, to talk about nature on a kind of a regular basis. They found themselves and consider themselves far more enlightened than the people who are operating at the university. Their stated objective, and it's interesting that Arlene was putting the kind of the motto and the kind of ethos of the academy on her slide. In the same way, the Bordeaux Academy said their big kind of ethos was promoting mankind's happiness. And this obviously dovetailed to a certain extent with Enlightenment ideology that was in the air at the time. And one of the ways they did this was by proposing essay competitions, or as people said during the 18th century, prize puzzles, at least once and sometimes twice a year. These would be quote unquote physics-related subjects, subjects related to nature or medicine, the hidden qualities of air, the fluidity of bodies, where did kidney stones come from, the source of earthquakes. And among these contests, there's also a pretty clear interest in the specificity of non-European and especially African anatomy. And one of the founding members had actually written a small paper on this before the Academy was founded. But by 1739, this becomes much more explicit with the contest on black skin and hair, which they announce in Europe's premier scientific journal, the Journal des Savants, the Journal of the Savants, which is distributed and read throughout Europe. Now, in researching this book, I found that people were discussing this contest all over the place, in Swedish coffee houses, in Germany, all over France, at the Royal Academy in London, and I even found somebody was talking about this in Virginia. And the call for papers on the cause of black skin and hair promised the winner a gold medal worth 300 livres, or pounds, more or less, roughly the annual salary of a common worker at the time. And so the first question you're probably asking yourself is, why would Bordeaux want to sponsor this contest? And I think it's really important to underscore that Bordeaux's very identity had become very much linked with the wealth flowing from the slave-based economies of the French Caribbean. And I'm talking here about Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Saint-Domingue, which becomes Haiti in 1804. Let's see. I wanted to show you, this is a slide I took actually 2 weeks ago. It's the kind of gratuitous image of the Caribbean, just to kind of remind us there's kind of a different world out there. This is La Pagerie in Martinique. This is where Josephine, Napoleon's wife and Empress of France, was born. Anyway, Bordeaux had deep links. This is a sugar mill here right on her plantation. Bordeaux had deep links to all these islands. And by the 18th century, the port had become the busiest, actually, the busiest port in France, and much of it came from this trade. Here's now an image of the port in Bordeaux. It's called the Port de la Lune, the Moon Port. At the time of the contest, in 1739, approximately 30 ships were dedicated full time to trade with the Caribbean. They went back and forth. There was, of course, some interest in the slave trade. Incidentally, Bordeaux kind of was slow to get going in the slave trade because they were making so much money on wine and other commodities. But in the 1730s and 1740s, they were making really a bundle by transporting various commodities and to Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Saint-Domingue, and then they were refining things coming back, particularly sugar, and distributing them all over Europe. And Bordeaux's great families became very much involved with this, whether they were lawyers, merchants, manufacturers, or vintners. They had lots of contacts with the French islands. And ultimately, Bordeaux's investments centered very heavily on Saint-Domingue, as I said, Haiti. In fact, by the end of the 18th century, the majority of Saint-Domingue's 800 sugar plantations, 3,000 indigo plantations, 3,000 coffee plantations, and 700 cotton plantations were owned by families from Bordeaux, to give you an idea of the kind of control that Bordeaux had over this island. When, after the Haitian Revolution, Bordeaux starts having a very, very tough time, incidentally. Anyway, Bordeaux is an astonishingly beautiful city. If you haven't seen Bordeaux, it's really worth going to. It's been kind of redone. The wealth from the 18th century can still be seen throughout Bordeaux. A stunning cityscape where I think about 5,000 new stone buildings were erected during the 18th century. They called this the golden age for France. for Bordeaux. Here's a quick image of right from the port. That's not the Garonne River, that's a fountain, I believe. But this is a building, this is a complex. It was constructed in the 1730s and 1740s called Place de la Bourse, or the stock market area. But over here to the on the left side was actually the customs house in Bordeaux. So you can imagine the ships pulling up and all the merchandise being weighed and taxed here right downtown in downtown Bordeaux. Now, the most telltale vestiges of Bordeaux's colonial involvement can actually be found on some of the buildings in Bordeaux. If you look up at these so-called mascarons, these kind of bas-relief statues or images that we find above some of the porte cochère, the big doors for coach-sized doors in some of the buildings in France. There's not a lot of them. There's about 5 in Bordeaux, but these are really a telling reminder that the city's slave traders were responsible for transporting 150,000 Africans to New World plantations between 1672 and 1837. To put this kind of in other words, Bordeaux's participation represented about 12% of the 1.2 million enslaved Africans who arrived alive in the French colonies. Another way of thinking about this is looking at Bordeaux's population itself. Demographics are very telling. In 1789, the population of Bordeaux was 110,000 people, which is to say that Bordeaux had sent over a number of Africans which actually surpassed their own population. The demographics during the 18th century are very telling. If about 12 or 13 million Africans were deported, enslaved Africans were deported to New World colonies from Brazil all the way to North America, especially the Caribbean. We have to remember that at that time period, there were only 25 million people living in France, which was an enormous country, 6 million in England, and in North America, there were only 1.1 million Europeans or people of European descent and of African descent. So anyway, again, 150,000 people for one port is a lot. So let's talk briefly about the essays themselves. I think I'm going to stop sharing so I can gesticulate. You can see me moving around here. And what they can tell us about the history of the concept of race. This is a cache of manuscripts that were all, the manuscripts were submitted anonymously to the Academy, and they tell us a lot. It's really like a focus group, a diverse cluster of men, naturalists, anatomists, climate theorists, theologians, who were all speculating on Africans at the very moment where the idea of race was coming into being. And coming to grips with what is actually at stake in these essays necessitates taking a step back into the exoticism of the past. And we have to remember, above all, that these essayists lacked both the science of genetics and forensic anthropology. And what does this mean? This means that these white-centered Europeans would have scoffed at the idea that the Earth's humans can trace their origins to an original group of East African hominids that spread out over the globe approximately 100,000 years ago. Now, in addition to the real impossibility of conceiving of the so-called out of Africa narrative, these timescales, talking about 100,000 years here, would have been unimaginable to the 18th century. And I think equally tough to grasp would have been the idea that the world's northern or white populations are themselves the descendants of ancient dark-skinned Africans, and that whiteness itself is the mutation, the chance result of migration and natural selection for vitamin D starved bodies. Now, this said, the writers that submitted their essays had their own explanations for the source or origin of Blackness. And in fact, there's a staggering range of possibilities, which allows us to think that, that in the kind of intellectual history continuum, there wasn't just one idea moving through time. There are a lot of kind of competing ideas. If you slice history vertically as opposed to telling it horizontally, we see a really kind of a different kind of a set of data coming out. Here are some of the ideas that I found in these essays. Adam or Eve was black. Adam was half black. Blackness is a mark of God, denoting sinfulness. God made all people white, but some unknown exterior cause generated blackness. Blackness is a God-given gift, allowing people of the torrid zone to live fruitfully. God transmits ethical proclivities to people who then advance these principles toward glory or toward degeneration. A moral defect in parents, a, quote, perverse disposition of the mind, unquote, might lead their progeny to be black. There was somebody who talked about Newtonian optics and said that blackness results from the absorption of light. Somebody else, blackness arises from vapors that emanate from the skin. Africans have darkened semen. Blackness results from the blood, and blacks have darker blood because of the effect of air. There's a specific body that courses in the veins of a specific liquid that courses in the veins of black bodies. White skin has a larger number of tubes filled with transparent liquid. And if certain traits, somebody reasoned, produce if certain climates produce certain traits, for example, people in England have red hair, then why not people in the African region? Why isn't it the case that it's just simply a result of the heat of that area? And there's obviously numerous battles going on among these thinkers. I mean, the most obvious is probably a battle between religious and kind of secular or naturalist theories. As I said, there was a total of 16 of these, 8 in Latin, 8 in French. And, one of the things that my students talk about when I discuss this contest is that they say, well, I thought the Enlightenment is a time of reason and progress and rationality. And it's important to underscore that in scientific circles, this is still a time when people are ecclesiastics and very devout lay people are trying to engage very deeply. The Jesuits, for example, are very much trying to produce a kind of enlightened religious type of science at the time. Anyway, among those people who have a religious orientation, it's really fascinating to see that the desire on their part had little to do with determining the source of black skin and black hair. The real goal was putting forth a kind of biblically compatible vision of anthropology, a vision of human difference that was really super, that lined up really nicely with scripture. And these religious-oriented contributors often attempted to give credence to 3 truths related to the creation story. And the first was the biblical chronology. At this point, I'm going to turn start sharing again. Excuse me. The first of these is the question of chronology, the belief based on a literal reading of the Bible that God had created the earth less than 6,000 years before. This was something that was very important for these people. And here I'm throwing up a slide from the Royal Almanac from 1741, the same year that the contest was publicized or was decided upon. And take a look at this chronology here. It was calculated that Earth was 5,741 years old, that 4,000 years had elapsed between the creation and the birth of Jesus Christ, that the flood had happened about 2,000 years before Christ was born, and of course, the French monarchy had been around for 1,300 years. And as important as this biblical and certainly political timescale was I think the status of nature itself here. And for the most orthodox of biblical scholars, nature had no autonomous history. It was static, it was fixed, it was providentialist. It was a category that was based entirely on God's will, and it didn't change. It always been the same since creation. And there's another important idea related to Christian anthropology, and that's the notion that according to scripture, all the world's peoples were not only created by God, but were God's children, members of the larger family of humankind, the descendants of Noah's three sons. Now here we have an anonymous 17th century painting of the naked Noah and his three sons. I don't want to go too much into the whole curse of Ham here. Suffice it to say that Noah had these three sons, Japheth, Shem, and Ham was the indiscreet of the three. He looks at his father's nakedness when his father was drunk, and Noah subsequently cursed Ham's descendants, specifically his son Canaan, to become the servant of servants. And obviously, this is a justification for enslavement in this one kind of branch of the human race as a whole. And several of the essayists provided incredibly convoluted interpretations of this parable, asserting that Ham's grandson Cush went on to populate Ethiopia, which is a term for all of Africa at this time, and that these so-called Hamites were not only destined to be slaves, but to become darkened in the process. And here I should point out that the notion that Ham was black or Ham's children became black is not in the Bible at all, but had been put forward by some Talmudic and ancient Christian biblical exegetes. And this was adopted by a number of Christians in the 17th, 18th century, and particularly it was a very effective kind of parable in the American South. Now the myth or the curse of Ham has another side too, a somewhat positive proto-biological notion that's embedded here. And that is that the Bible states unequivocally that humankind shared one origin, that all people had come from a so-called monogenesis. And this shows up in the New Testament as well, when Paul tells the Athenians, God hath made of one blood all nations of men. Now this monogenetic notion brings us to the precise language that the Bordeaux Academy used in constructing its question for the Journal des Savants. And this is something I haven't gotten to yet. The question, as they stated it, was, what is the source of the degeneration of black hair and black skin? And this is really the key to this whole contest. Human degeneration was considered by many people to be as real as we consider evolution or gravity. Today, the term degenerate usually conjures up somebody who has lost the physical, mental, or moral qualities considered normal and desirable. In fact, it's not a very PC term. This same basic concept functions on the level of human species in the Academy's question. When they asked the contestants to identify the causes of African degeneration, the Bordeaux Academy was asserting that Black humans were somehow debased and corrupted, albeit members of the human species. Now, describing an entire branch of humanity is certainly appalling. And yet it's important to note that the Academy's reliance on the concept of degeneration was actually designed to create a firewall between this idea of degeneration and a firewall rather between their competition and an even more horrible notion than degeneration. And that idea is polygenesis. And this is the notion, as we can see here on the slide, that the most extreme examples of humans, and at the time this category would have included not only Africans, but so-called Hottentots or Khoi people, and also Laplanders. So these extreme people were seen as potentially actually different species of humans who had come into being completely separately and independently from the white race or the white group at this point. Now, this explanation had first been put forward by a small group of radical biblical interpreters as early as the 16th century. And like other anthropological or proto-anthropological ideas floating around at this time, as I said, this is often a part of these very, very complicated religious debates. And polygenesis really started taking off after the discovery of a new type of humans, Native Americans, that had not been accounted for in the Bible. It then becomes a real threat to religious orthodoxy in 1655 when the Bordeaux theologian Isaac de la Pereire claimed that before God created the Jews, he had also given life to the tribes of Gentiles. And in this category, he included Native Americans, Eskimos, Africans, South Sea Islanders, Chinese, and Europeans, all of whom had initially lived in something akin to Hobbes's state of nature. Later on, the polygenists would say that, in fact, it was just a separate kind of a genesis for different people. It didn't bother with Gentiles and non-Gentiles. Now, during the contest, or for the contest, two of the contestants picked up on this idea of polygenesis, and they mentioned like Black Adams or pre-Adamite races at one of them mentioned as well, excuse me. Now, this form of polygenesis was still somewhat benign, apolitical. It wasn't really attached to race, and still pretty deeply embedded in these religious debates. But later versions of polygenesis, the separate origins theory, will be harnessed by anti-clerical thinkers in order to refute the Bible, and then also by pro-slavery thinkers who would obviously use this to justify the treatment of the Africans on a physical basis. And I'll come back to this in a second. Now, I've talked about some of the religious essays. I want to now get to some of the tendencies that we see associated with the scientific essays. And I want to begin with what I'd call the rising classificatory impulse that we see during the 18th century. We may be thinking about Linnaeus in 1735, but in the contest, primarily, there was one essayist who's fascinated by scientific classification, and he's thinking about a French antecedent, a guy by the name of François Bernier, who in 1684 published an article called The New Division of the Earth, La Nouvelle Division de la Terre, also in the Journal des Savants, where he maintained that humankind could be broken down into fixed, distinct, racialized categories, and he used the word race. He's the first to use the term in this way. The word race had been floating around, but was generally used as meaning kind of lineage, like a race of dogs, a race of kings. It had to do with bloodlines. Terms for humans were, depending on who was talking, but could be nations, peoples, and in the 17th century, also in 18th century, varieties. And variety is a botanical metaphor, whereas race is a zoological kind of construct, right? You can see the big difference. One implies hybridization and change over time, and a lineage is much more fixed and zoological. Now, Bernier did not really develop his essay too far. He certainly did not put forward a polygenesis theory at all as part of his scheme. But he certainly encouraged people to think of human beings as composed of, or the human species as composed of different races. And this was, as I said, really appealing to anti-clerical thinkers who used polygenesis against the Bible. And the most famous example of that during the 18th century was Voltaire. Voltaire went way beyond Bernier. He claimed that the anatomy and intelligence of Ethiopians differed so much from those of whites that it was clear that Blacks were members of an entirely distinct species with distinct origins. It's important to note that Voltaire was actually a corresponding member of the Bordeaux Academy of Sciences. And here I've got this quote. "It seems to me," he writes in 1734, "that my belief that there are different kinds of men, just as there are different kinds of trees, is well founded. Pear trees, fir trees, oak trees, and apricot trees do not at all come from the same kind of tree. And the bearded whites, the wool-bearing Africans, the horse-haired yellows, and the beardless men do not originally come from the same species of man." Now, the Academy had bylaws that expressly forbade putting forward any views that would be contrary to religion, and they did not want to encourage any kind of polygenist ideas. That's why they called the contest a degeneration kind of contest. They were forcing their essayists to explain how the degeneration of Black skin and hair came about, and they were also predetermining the type of essay that should win the contest. An essay that implicitly respected a biblical understanding of humankind, even if it didn't mention the Bible. What they were looking for really was an explanation that would show how an original group of white people were related to the supposedly degenerate Africans. And most of the essayists who submitted entries really got this. And this was especially true for the partisans of climate theory. And now among these, the many different kind of naturalist theories, climate theory was by far the most popular. And climate theory, or environmental theory, was anything but new at the time. As early as 400 BCE, Hippocrates had written a climatological treatise entitled Airs, Waters, and Places that posited a causal relationship between extreme environments and the minds and bodies of people living under such conditions. It was also linked to humoral tendencies as well. So this kind of bioclimatic theory was an appealing choice for many of the Bordeaux essayists for a couple of reasons. First, it rendered the story of Noah's Ark slightly more scientific. You could posit that Noah's 3 sons took off and went in a different direction. It was the climate that changed them, not necessarily a curse. Climate theory also allowed the era's naturalists to identify the temperate European climate as a source of white cognitive, aesthetic, and ethical superiority. It's a kind of a naturalist view of white superiority here. Essayist number 2, as I called him, put this very clearly. He writes, "It is only in intermediate regions, especially the warmer ones, that we find fertility and agile minds, an agreeable activity in external manners, and a delicate sensibility in pleasures." Now, emerging here is the belief that the environment not only determines the type of people who inhabit a certain land, but that the temperate European region positioned whiteness as humankind's primary and best color. And we can talk about how this evolves after the contest in later years. And climate theory also becomes a very, very important tool among a new group of secularly minded thinkers who were envisioning a far more fluid understanding of human history that had been the case in the past. And this explains one of the really bizarre things that you find inside this contest, the concept of something I call racial reversibility. Essayist number 4, for example, maintained that African traits were only temporary accidents brought on by food, drink, climate, and the custom of applying oily salves. And essayist number 8, who's a really very interesting person, proposed himself as a living example of this the possibility of racial reversibility. He explained that one of his ancestors was taken from Africa, from Mauritius, actually from Mauritania rather, and that his skin at this current time showed no traces of the pigmentation that his great-great-great-grandfather had had. In his words, any Ethiopian who moved to colder climates would, over several generations, not only lose his blackness in the skin, but all African traits. Obviously, this was not the environment, this is the fact that his ancestors had mingled with European populations. It's also interesting in the essays to see that some people maintain the same thing about Europeans. The idea was if you send a group of Europeans to the Congo, for example, Englishmen to the Congo for 200 years, that they too would become Black. Now this idea of racial reversibility reveals several things about 18th century race thinking. The first is that the category of race for certain people really couldn't exist as a fixed category, but it also points to an increasingly dynamic and bubbling understanding of nature, sometimes almost Lucretian, where things happen fast. Now, this really obviously comes in contrast with the implicit fixism of the creationist kind of understanding of humanity. There is really, in the 1740s and 1750s, a new generation of people that are asserting that natural forces acting on matter could produce accidents, including human accidents, that were outside of God's jurisdiction, if they even talked about God. And this brings me to somebody I'm writing about right now. I've written about him quite a bit. He's such a kind of really important figure in 18th century thought. He doesn't get enough credit. He's really the most important, from my viewpoint, most important naturalist between Aristotle and Darwin, more important than Linnaeus in a lot of ways. And when I'm talking about Buffon, he didn't participate in the contest, but several years after the contest, he synthesizes a lot of things in the air. particularly things having to do with human mutability. In 1749, this is Georges Leclerc, the Comte de Buffon, picks up where a lot of these people had left off and synthesizes many of these climatological notions. And he writes in the Natural History, which is really one of the 2 or 3 best-selling books of the 18th century. He talks about what happens to people as they move around. As soon as mankind began to move around the world and spread from climate to climate, its nature was subject to various alterations. These changes were minimal in temperate regions, lands that we presume to be the place of its origin. But these changes increased as man moved farther and farther away. And when centuries had passed, continents had been crossed, offspring had degenerated due to the influence of different lands. And many people had decided to settle in extreme climates and populate the desert sands of southern lands and the frozen regions of the north. These changes became so significant and so apparent that it would have been understandable to believe that the Negro, the Laplander, and the white constituted different species, polygenesis. But these markings are in no way original or distinct. These natural alterations, these differences being only on the exterior, are superficial. It is in fact certain that all humans are nothing more than the same man who has been adorned with black in the torrid zone and has become tan and shriveled by the glacial cold at the Earth's pole. Now, this view of the world cuts both ways, of course. On the one hand, Buffon is first forcefully asserting that differences among the world's people are only skin deep. And yet he's also suggesting the ancestral and qualitative supremacy of a white prototype race, a race that, quote, having multiplied and spread across the surface of the globe in time, produce all of humankind's varieties. And what is more, far more than any other thinker before him, Buffon processed these ethnographic prejudices and data into a coherent proto-racial chronicle of the human species. He put humans and black humans and white humans into a time-based narrative. Now, as I've been suggesting, explaining the source and meaning of blackness during the 18th century from a, quote, scientific, unquote, point of view, occupied 3 distinct but mutually influencing thinkers. Traditional natural historians who wanted just to describe nature and humankind's varieties, taxonomists or classifiers who broke the species down into conceptual categories, and finally, a group I haven't really alluded to yet, the anatomists. The anatomists were also present in the 1741 contest, particularly a guy by the name of Pierre Barrère, who was a Perpignan surgeon who had served in the French colony of Guyana as a surgeon and a botanist. And he claimed in his essay that he had found the secret to blackness while dissecting cadavers of enslaved Africans. Total pseudoscience. And it's one of the many examples I've found while looking around at 18th century anatomy, and particularly anatomical treatises that had to do with different ethnicities and races. These guys would head off on almost like hunting expeditions for specific anatomical features, finding them even though they didn't exist. In the published version of his essay, Barrère said that he had found the Africans' bile was as dark as ink and their blood was a reddish black. And this idea of dissecting Africans and looking for specific anatomical ideas or features really takes off. There's a person named Lecat in Rouen who does the same thing in 1675. There's a German named Meckel who says that African brains are black in 1755. Even Thomas Jefferson is going to be referencing these kind of anatomical discoveries in the Notes on Virginia in the 19th century. Now, in many ways, the contest had found its winner in Barrère. Ultimately, they didn't give a prize. They abandoned the contest. But Barrère had the most influence on a lot of different people. Even Buffon, when he's writing the natural history, said, well, this is really quite significant, this black blood, this black bile, but we should really kind of concentrate on the idea of degeneration. He was nervous about the rising importance of anatomy. He wasn't interested in that. But there are a lot of other people who really found this to be, incredibly important. And over time, these much more kind of racialized concepts helped a new generation of classifiers produce much more trenchant categories, way more trenchant than Linnaeus, for example, in 1735, or way more trenchant than Bernier in 1684. Take, for example, the father of anthropology, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. He's an abolitionist and actually very open-minded about Africans, but still in all, by 1775, he's looking at the Ethiopian's dry and heavy body, ash-colored brain and spinal cord as part of his classification of the human species into separate races and categories. Now, it would be a stretch to say that the Academy really brought about the racialization of the African during the 18th century. As I said, the contest was called off in 1741, and these essays were, just languishing in the archives until I really kind of went back and started reading them. And yet, really, the Academy did help bring about a new era, an era in which science would claim the right to provide compelling and yet spurious naturalistic explanations of race, an era where and anatomically based theories began to explain intelligence, morality, and sexual habits, an era where classification schemes broke humankind down into new zoological categories. Before 1750, and even after 1750, for many thinkers, including Buffon, the word to refer to different kinds of people was varieties, it wasn't races. These new methods and discoveries that we first see in the Bordeaux Academy of Science contest would also have another function as well, vindicating the ongoing dehumanization of people of color in the Americas. Blackness, after all, was not just a color, it had become synonymous with slavery. Now, I was going to end here with a quick anecdote, but I think I'll probably just go right to questions because we have 15 minutes left. I will just say that very quickly that Voltaire made fun of this contest in Candide, probably much to the chagrin of the Bordeaux Academy of Sciences, because he said that this was a red sheep that Candide had, and he brought it to Bordeaux, donated it to the Bordeaux Academy of Sciences, and the Bordeaux Academy of Sciences, of course, ran a contest on it. And in contrast to the actual contest, they did name a winner for this contest in Candide. And according to Voltaire's story, they saw the sheep's unusual color as an excuse for yet another contest and quickly proposed a prize competition for that year. And the person who won was a scholar from the North who demonstrated by A plus B minus C divided by Z that the sheep had to be red and would die of the mange. Anyway, I'll leave it right there, and maybe we can have a few questions.
Thank you very much, Andy, for a really interesting talk. So I want to again encourage people to please drop questions into the chat so that I can share them with our speaker. And I will start us off. I would like to actually talk a little bit with you for a moment, not about the content of your talk, but about the whole issue of the archives of these manuscripts at the Academy. Can you speak, you talked a little bit at the beginning about how they were languishing in there until you kind of rediscovered them. Can you talk a little bit about the archives themselves, the manuscripts themselves, and just share some of that?
Yeah, people had referred to this, I think, as early as 1930, but it was always in a kind of a footnote. And the manuscripts were held by the Royal Academy of Sciences, and then after the Revolution, all the academies were shut down. as being aristocratic institutions. And so then they were, they became property of the state and were handed down. I was very lucky that they didn't burn, because there were several times when various archives in Bordeaux caught fire. They're located in the municipal library, which is a fantastic library in Bordeaux. So they're there. And there's another archive where I discovered a summary of what went on during the proceedings, where they decided what to do. Alas, and I think I saw a question in the chat about that. Alas, the person who took the notes, the 3 or 4 pages of notes, must have been drunk. It was just absolutely unintelligible. So I really couldn't tell what went on. But to kind of, I think again in the chat I saw this question: why did they drop the contest? Well, they dropped a number of contests. If they didn't find an answer that was really up to snuff, that corresponded to everyone's expectations, or if there was a real debate among one of the topics, then they didn't award a prize. And one of the things that's also really interesting about that, if I could kind of digress there a little bit, is that the Academy had decided in 1726 that when they, and this was in the archives, when they didn't award a prize, they would buy stock in the Compagnie des Indes, which was one of the trading companies that was involved with the slave trade. So there's a link between the science and slavery right there. Yeah, so I think I've got a couple ideas why they didn't do it, all this pure speculation. One of them is that they may have disagreed on some of these essays, because either they were too religious or too scientific. If they rejected the kind of the existence of God or didn't talk about it at all, some of the more conservative thinkers in the Academy might not have liked that. People are very nervous about that. Buffon got in real trouble for some of his ideas having to do with humankind, called before the Sorbonne, rapped on the knuckles, so on and so forth. And it may also have been that a couple of them came late, and maybe the one that was the best essay came late, like Barrère's essay, which was published. He published this in 1741 and says, "I was encouraged by the Bordeaux Academy to publish this." And it may have been that came late, because I did read that some of these things came late. So, and that may have just disqualified the best one.
So is there any evidence that the contest was known by American colonists?
Yes, there was. There is a man in Virginia. I think his name was Dr. Mitchell, and he wrote to the Royal Academy about this in 1743 with a huge essay on his own about the origin of Blackness. And he said that, oh, I'm too late for the prize puzzle, but I did write this up. So you can see that it was being talked about all over the place. I'm sure people were talking about it in Philadelphia in particular, and clearly was going on in the French colonies as well. I mean, there was another contest that I'm publishing in the book, which is perhaps even more interesting, from 1772. And that is, when I was in the archives, I said, my God, there's another contest here. And this contest was on how, it's much more kind of attached to kind of the New York Academy of Medicine, how to make the Middle Passage more essentially better and nicer, right? Particularly in relationship to the diseases from which Africans suffer during the Middle Passage. So it was a proper kind of medical kind of contest. And that too was really interesting to see. They abandoned that contest as well, again, probably because it was such a polemical thing in the 1770s. At that point, the anti-slavery movement was really taking off.
So if there was no contest winner, which we know, what was the impact of these essays? Or do you just see them as a reflection of the thinking of the time?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think that they did get people talking about this, and I think the big kind of payoff for this whole thing is that these scientific institutions arrogated to themselves the right to talk about race. They said, this is a proper subject for us. So the institutional power to kind of talk about these things meant that they were taking it away from the church. The church had supplied 90% of the kind of anthropology. Every single person in France, pretty much in the 1740s, 30s, went to catechism. They learned about Noah and 3 kids and so on and so forth. They absorbed that as truth. And so polygenesis, or even just a regular kind of anthropological kind of view of humankind would have been really heretical for a lot of different people. But the fact that academies were allowing this to take place was very significant. So that's, I think, very important. The essays themselves, absolutely no effect, except Barrère was incredibly important, really very important. He really pushed an entire era toward more anatomical understandings of human difference, which then infused the classifiers. I kind of skimmed over that part, but Kant, Blumenbach, Exelman, all these Germans looked at all this French scholarship and from the anatomists who really kind of proved, quote unquote, that different kinds of people were very, very different anatomically.
So that's actually a nice lead into the next question. So your talk is an indictment of early institutionalized pseudoscience and shows so well the connections of science to political economy concerns. I'm wondering what normative consequences you see for how we should evaluate contemporary scientific projects. Also, was there much pushback at the time? You mentioned Voltaire mocking the Academy and Candide. Did this extend more widely?
Wow, what a wonderful question. That's another half hour question. Yeah, I think that the Academy, first, like in terms of norms and practice, it varied so widely and it evolved so quickly. The fact that they were always reflecting kind of, I suppose we are now too, right? But there's always a reflection of what was going on kind of politically in the Academy. And I would rather call this maybe not an indictment, but in kind of an expose. I'm revealing what was going on there, and people are trapped by certain epistemologies. I think it's important when I talk to students that if you lived in Nantes, for example, or Liverpool, and you were brought up to think about the world from the people who are in the slave trading ports, there's pretty much no way you can escape from being a horrific racist. There are books that I stumbled upon that were, when people are just becoming literate, particularly women, they're teaching women to be racist. It's absolutely astonishing kind of geographical books at the time. So how do we stand back from this whole thing? How do we evaluate these texts and what they mean? I think it is absolutely true that we're seeing a kind of a subcurrent that we don't really tend to think of when we're talking about the history of race or the history of medicine, history of science. And when we come to the contemporary era, I think that it's really important, and this is why the NYAM is so wonderful, that there's a diachronic side to NYAM, right? In that you're so engaged in all these wonderful things that you're doing. At the same time, you have a real awareness of the past and where medicine comes from. And I think that kind of studying medicine allows us to kind of interrogate the way we do contemporary science as well, particularly when it comes to kind of different categories of people. And having been getting your newsletters and things for the past few years, I can see that has been it's really, really part of the way you guys are operating, and you're helping to change practices everywhere. I can't really speak to contemporary practice everywhere in different disciplines. I don't know enough about what's taking place in cutting edge biology, for example. But I know that knowledge has been cut up and segmented in so many different small parts that some of these monster questions that we're dealing with right here, like where people come from, are probably just not being evaluated by contemporary scientists in the same way. It's a tough question for me to answer.
So the next question is there any reference to the Academy in Diderot?
To the Bordeaux Academy, I don't think so. I'm so happy that someone asked a Diderot question though there. That's wonderful. I really don't think so. Maybe in passing, but certainly he was very much attached to a lot of the members of the Paris Academy of Sciences. There was the biggie, right? That met in the Louvre. The Louvre at that time was no longer a palace for Louis XIV. Louis XIV goes to Versailles. The Louvre becomes an open place for a lot of different places, the Academy of Sciences, the Academy of Inscription, and so on and so forth. So the Academy met right in the Louvre. And Diderot would go there all the time and meet with different people. He was very much into chemistry and protobiology and so on and so forth. So he was very aware of a lot of the academy debates, particularly debates having to do with what I call accidentalism. The idea that nature could make accidents was fascinating for him. That was something that was very freeing in a very kind of Lucretian way. So yeah, the academy was very important for him, but mostly the Paris Academy, I would say.
So we have two more questions, and I think that's really exactly what we have time for. The first of those questions is: Graeber and Wengrow in The Dawn of Everything show that such contests crucially shaped the career of Rousseau and his theory of the noble savage, as well as Turgot's forceful disagreement with Rousseau. If this new book is correct, the legacy of these 18th century contests is still very much alive in modern anthropology. So it's more of a comment.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, these contests were very democratic in a lot of ways. You think about Rousseau this is a reference to the discourse on the origins of inequality among men in 1751, I believe. Hugely important for kind of anthropological theory, because he's talking about the stage theory of natural man moving toward civilization and therefore degrading himself and dehumanizing himself. And so we talk about that all the time these days. Hugely, hugely important, both for political science, for anthropology, and so on and so forth. So these contests, as I said, were very democratic. Rousseau was really nobody at the time, although he's writing operas and doing all sorts of other stuff. He is actually changing the way people think thanks to these contests. They're hugely important. They may have been organized by the elite, but it did allow for new voices to be heard.
And the last question is, and it's actually a good ending question: what are you and Skip Gates hoping that your new publication is going to do or achieve? And it's, of course, not just your publication, but, as I know from my conversations with you, that you're planning this great online presence with a timeline that explores some of these questions as well.
Yeah, I taught a class on history of race in the Cheshire prison this past semester, which was absolutely fascinating. And I think that there, more than anywhere else, I realized that the history of race is something we really do not teach. Don't teach it really in high school. We don't teach it, certainly don't teach it in high school, and we don't teach it that much in college. It's a very painful subject. But I think it's also an emancipatory subject for a lot of people, particularly who've been affected by racism and race theory over the years. My students, 90% African Americans, said they found it very freeing to go back and realize it's all a huge made up lie in a lot of this stuff, coming from science and medicine and so on and so forth. People have always known that, but going back and looking at it, I think is very powerful, a powerful move. And I got into this whole thing because I was interested in history of biology, and I just, was gravitated toward it because I thought it would be very important. And I found it to be really very tough sometimes, particularly white guy talking about it. But it has been, I think, very rewarding. And I think that bringing this to this is published by Harvard, but it's published as a trade book. We did an article for the New York Review of Books. I've written for Time magazine about this as well, the history of race, why that's an important thing to study. So I think that we're trying to kind of push people to thinking not only about critical race theory, but actually, the kind of some really historical things having to do with the origins of race. So that's how I'd answer that question.
Thank you. I can't thank you enough for a fascinating talk that really kind of has left us all, I think, with more to think about.
Yeah.
And, as I mentioned earlier, at the introduction to this, the talk was recorded. It will, in fact, appear on our YouTube channel soon. And if you were registered for the talk, you should get a notification of when that happens. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here with us today.
Thank you. Well, fabulous questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andy.
Contemporary science, tough question, but really great questions. Yeah, just know that the people who come to your lectures are really the varsity team. Those are really great questions.
Yes, we do get very good questions. And of course, your topic is just full of really, really interesting material, questions, all kinds of things. I mean, I'm so looking forward to the book when it's out and to your next project. So really, thank you so much for being with us today, and we'll be in touch soon.
All right, great. All right, take care. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.